My name is Sarah Mitchell, 31, and I never imagined that cutting short a conference in San Francisco would lead to the most shocking discovery of my life. After 5 intensive days presenting my architectural designs for sustainable housing developments, I was exhausted but exhilarated. The conference had exceeded all expectations. My innovative eco-friendly apartment complex designs had attracted attention from major developers, and I had secured 3 potential contracts that could launch my independent practice to new heights. All I wanted was to return to my peaceful downtown apartment, order takeout, and celebrate quietly with a glass of wine while reviewing my notes. Instead, I found my building's lobby crowded with unfamiliar faces, the elevator constantly occupied, and sounds of celebration echoing through the hallways. When I finally reached the 15th floor and approached my apartment door, I could hear music, laughter, and dozens of conversations happening inside my home. The key turned in my lock, but as I pushed open the door, I was greeted by a scene that defied comprehension. My minimalist, carefully curated living space had been transformed into Party Central. A large handmade banner stretched across my dining room while reading "Blood is thicker than water" in elaborate gold lettering. Beneath it, at least 85 people filled every corner of my apartment. Relatives I recognized from childhood family reunions, distant cousins I hadn't seen in years, and elderly faces that looked vaguely familiar but whose names I couldn't recall. Let me explain why this discovery felt like a betrayal that cut to my core. I'm an only child who grew up feeling perpetually out of step with my extended family's values and expectations. While they celebrated traditional paths, marriage, children, staying close to home, I pursued architecture, moved to the city, and built a career focused on innovative design rather than following conventional routes. My parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, had always been supportive but somewhat bewildered by my choices. When they decided to downsize 3 years ago, selling the family home where I'd grown up, I offered to help them find a nice retirement community. Instead, they surprised me by announcing they wanted to move into my building, not into my apartment. They weren't that presumptuous, but into a smaller unit on the 8th floor that had become available. At first, I was touched by their desire to be close. We could have regular dinners, I could help with any issues that arose, and they'd be part of my daily life in a way that felt natural rather than forced. The arrangement worked well initially. Mom would occasionally drop by with homemade meals when I was working late on projects. Dad would help me with minor repairs or move heavy furniture when I rearranged my workspace. However, boundaries gradually became blurred. Mom started letting herself in to tidy up while I was at work, rearranging my carefully organized design materials and moving personal items to locations she deemed more appropriate. When I gently asked her to check with me before coming over, she seemed hurt. "I'm just trying to help, Sarah. You work such long hours, and this place gets so messy." Dad began treating my apartment as an extension of their own space, using my kitchen when theirs was being repaired, storing their holiday decorations in my closet, and inviting neighbors up to see Sarah's beautiful place without asking permission. Again, when I tried to establish boundaries, I was met with confusion and mild resentment. "We're family," he'd say. "Since when do we need formal arrangements between us?" The situation became more complicated when my cousin Derek, my mother's nephew, went through a difficult divorce 6 months ago. Mom suggested he stay in my guest room just temporarily while he got back on his feet. I agreed, thinking it would be a few weeks at most. Derek was grateful and respectful initially, but weeks turned into months. He began treating my apartment as his own, bringing dates over without notice, using my home office for his online job interviews, and generally making me feel like a guest in my own space. When I finally insisted Derek find his own place, the family reaction was swift and condemning. I was being selfish, unsupportive, and forgetting what family meant. Derek eventually moved in with another cousin, but the damage to family relationships was evident. I was no longer the successful architect they occasionally bragged about to neighbors. I had become the cold, career-obsessed relative who put work before family, 3 months ago. I learned about the San Francisco conference, a gathering of sustainable architecture innovators that could significantly advance my career. I'd been selected to present my designs alongside some of the most respected names in green building. It was the professional opportunity I'd been working toward for years. I informed my parents about the dates I'd be away, asking if they could keep an eye on my plants and collect any important mail. Dad assured me everything would be handled, and Mom promised to water my orchids properly. "Have a wonderful time, sweetheart," she said. "We'll take good care of everything here." What she didn't mention was that they were planning to take care of much more than my plants. The conference exceeded every expectation. My presentation on vertical gardens in urban housing received a standing ovation. 3 different development companies approached me afterward with serious inquiries about collaboration. Dr. Richardson, one of the most influential voices in sustainable architecture, personally invited me to contribute to a groundbreaking project in Portland. I was riding high on professional validation and excited about future possibilities. I had planned to stay through the final networking session on Sunday evening, but when Dr. Richardson suggested we continue our conversation over an early dinner, I rearranged my flight to return home Saturday night instead. I wanted to review our discussion in the comfort of my own space and begin preparing proposals for the opportunities that had emerged. I stopped at the airport gift shop and picked up some small presents: a Golden Gate Bridge snow globe for Mom's collection, locally made chocolates for Dad, and a beautiful coffee table book about San Francisco architecture that I thought they'd enjoy browsing through. I was genuinely excited to share my success with them and perhaps, finally, receive the kind of recognition and pride I'd always craved from my family. How foolishly optimistic I was. The taxi dropped me off outside my building around 8 p.m. I noticed more cars than usual parked along the street, but downtown on a Saturday night, that wasn't particularly unusual. It wasn't until I reached the lobby and found it crowded with people holding balloons, gift bags, and covered dishes that suspicion began to creep in. The elevator was occupied by a group of people I vaguely recognized, faces from family gatherings, but no one I could definitively name. They seemed surprised to see me, exchanging glances and suddenly becoming quiet. One elderly woman smiled uncertainly and said, "Hello, dear. You look familiar. Are you going to the party too?" My stomach dropped. "What party?" "The family reunion upstairs," she replied cheerfully. "Such a wonderful celebration. Your parents have been planning it for months." The word echoed in my head as the elevator climbed to my floor. When the doors opened, the hallway was filled with people, some sitting on the floor, others leaning against walls, all clearly part of whatever was happening in my apartment. I pushed through the crowd, my rolling suitcase catching on people's feet, apologizing automatically while my mind raced to process what I was seeing. At my door, which stood wide open, I encountered my cousin Jennifer, whom I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral 4 years ago. "Sarah," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me in an enthusiastic hug. "You made it. We were wondering when you'd get here. Mom said you weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow." I stood frozen in her embrace, staring over her shoulder into my apartment. Every piece of furniture had been moved or rearranged. My dining table was covered with food dishes I didn't recognize. My living room was packed with relatives sitting on folding chairs that had appeared from somewhere. Children were running between rooms, and my carefully maintained minimalist aesthetic had been completely overwhelmed by the chaos of a massive family gathering. "I caught an earlier flight," I managed to say, gently extricating myself from Jennifer's hug. "What is all this?" "The Mitchell Anderson family reunion, silly. Don't you remember? Mom's been coordinating with Aunt Linda for months. Everyone's here, even great Uncle Frank drove down from Canada." I wanted to scream that I had no memory of any reunion because no one had told me about it, but Jennifer was already pulling me into the apartment, calling out announcements of my arrival. "Look who's here! Sarah made it after all." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Relatives I barely knew converged on me with hugs, kisses, and excited chatter about how wonderful it was to see me, how much I'd grown up, how successful I'd become. Through the crowd, I caught glimpses of my transformed living space. My home office had been converted into a children's play area, with my expensive drafting table covered by a plastic tablecloth and my architecture books stacked in corners to make room for toys. Someone had hung family photos on my walls, pictures I'd never seen before featuring various combinations of relatives, most of which didn't include me. My bedroom door was closed, but I could hear voices inside, suggesting people were using it for something. Through the chaos, I spotted my parents. Mom was in my kitchen, directing a team of ants in food preparation using my dishes, my utensils, and my appliances. Dad was in the living room, proudly showing off my awards and certificates to a group of uncles, finally acknowledging my achievements, but in a context I had never agreed to. When our eyes met across the room, Mom's face showed a flicker of surprise before she composed herself and waved me over with a bright smile. Dad looked momentarily uncomfortable before plastering on his usual jovial expression. I made my way through the crowd, feeling like an intruder in my own home. When I reached my parents, Mom immediately pulled me into a hug that felt performative, clearly intended for the audience of watching relatives. "Darling, you're early. We thought your flight wasn't until tomorrow." "I changed it," I replied, my voice carefully controlled. "What is this, Mom?" "The family reunion, sweetheart. Don't you remember us mentioning it?" The lie was so smooth, so confidently delivered, that for a moment I questioned my own memory. But I knew with absolute certainty that no one had mentioned any reunion to me. Not months ago, not weeks ago, not ever. Dad appeared beside Mom, his arms sliding around my shoulders in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. "Surprise! We thought it would be wonderful to finally get everyone together. Your place is perfect for this kind of gathering." "My place," I repeated slowly. "You're hosting a family reunion in my apartment." "Our family reunion," Mom corrected gently. "And you have such a lovely space for entertaining." "We knew you wouldn't mind." The assumption embedded in that statement that they knew I wouldn't mind, that my consent wasn't necessary, that my home was available for their use crystallized everything that had been wrong with our relationship for years. Before I could respond, my cousin Derek appeared, the same Derek who had overstayed his welcome in my guest room. He seemed particularly comfortable, moving through my space with the familiarity of someone who still considered it partially his. "Hey Sarah, great timing. We were just about to start the slideshow of family memories. I set up the projector in your bedroom since it's the only room big enough for everyone to gather." "My bedroom?" "They were using my bedroom for a family presentation. Who gave you permission to use my bedroom?" I asked, my composure finally cracking slightly. Derek looked genuinely confused. "Uncle Robert said you were fine with us using whatever space we needed. The living room's too crowded for the whole group." I turned to Dad, who suddenly found the floor very interesting. "You told people they could use my bedroom? Just for the presentation, sweetheart." "We needed somewhere everyone could sit comfortably." The casual violation of my most private space, the assumption that my belongings and boundaries were secondary to their event planning, was breathtaking in its audacity. But what came next was even worse. My great-aunt Martha, a woman I remembered as being particularly judgmental during my childhood, approached our group with a disapproving expression. "Linda dear, you didn't mention that Sarah keeps such a cluttered workspace." I had to move stacks of papers and architectural drawings to make room for the gift table in her office. My architectural drawings, my current projects, my carefully organized work materials that I needed for the proposals I was planning to develop based on the San Francisco meetings. "You moved my work papers?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "We just tidied up a bit," Mom said quickly. "Everything is safe. We put it all in boxes in your closet." "Boxes? In my closet?" My meticulously organized current projects, some of which contained confidential client information, had been carelessly boxed up and stored away to make room for a gift table I hadn't been told about for an event I hadn't been invited to plan. That's when the full scope of what had happened began to crystallize. This wasn't a spontaneous gathering or a miscommunication about dates. This was a deliberate, extensively planned event that had been kept secret from me while my own home was commandeered as the venue. How long have you been planning this? I asked my parents directly. Mom and Dad exchanged a glance that confirmed my suspicions. A few months, Dad admitted. It started small, just talking about getting the local family together. Then it grew as more people wanted to participate. And when exactly were you planning to tell me? Another exchange of glances. We thought you'd be more relaxed about it if we handled the details, Mom said. You've been so stressed with work lately, and we didn't want to burden you with party planning on top of everything else. The reasoning was so backwards, so fundamentally disrespectful, that I struggled to formulate a response. They had decided, without consulting me, that my stress levels justified excluding me from decisions about my own home. They had determined that my work commitments meant I wouldn't want to participate in family planning, so they had simply removed me from the equation entirely. Besides, Dad added, you're rarely home anyway, always traveling for work or staying late at the office. We figured you wouldn't even notice the preparations. The casual dismissal of my lifestyle, the implication that my absence from home justified their appropriation of it, stung worse than any overt insult could have. In their minds, my dedication to my career had forfeited my right to privacy and boundaries in my own living space. At that moment, my phone buzzed with a text from my colleague Marcus. Hope you're celebrating your San Francisco success. That Richardson opportunity could change everything for you. Can't wait to hear more details Monday. The irony was crushing. I had returned home eager to share my professional triumph with my family, only to discover they had been planning a celebration that deliberately excluded me while using my home as their venue. I need some air, I announced, setting down my suitcase and heading for my balcony. But even that refuge had been compromised. Several relatives were out there smoking and chatting, having made themselves comfortable in every corner of my living space. I retreated to my bathroom, the only place that seemed momentarily private, and locked the door behind me. In the mirror, I saw my own face, flushed with anger and disbelief. My hands were shaking slightly as I gripped the sink edge and tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just about the reunion. It was about years of boundary violations, assumptions about my availability, and a fundamental lack of respect for my autonomy. It was about being perpetually cast as the family member whose life and space were less important than everyone else's comfort and convenience. When I emerged from the bathroom, I found Derek setting up a microphone in my living room. We're about to start the family history presentation, he announced to the crowd. Everyone gather in Sarah's bedroom so great Uncle Frank can share stories about the old days. The sight of my relatives filing into my bedroom, settling onto my bed and floor as if it were a public gathering space, was the final straw. I had reached my limit. I approached my parents, who were directing traffic flow toward my bedroom, and spoke quietly but firmly. We need to talk now. In private, Mom looked around at the bustling activity. Can't it wait until after the presentation? Uncle Frank has been preparing his stories for weeks. No, I said. It cannot wait. Something in my tone must have conveyed that this wasn't negotiable, because Dad nodded toward my kitchen. Let's step over here. We moved to the kitchen, which was still occupied by several aunts cleaning dishes and organizing leftovers. Privately, I emphasized, Dad asked the aunts to give us a moment, and we crowded into the small kitchen alcove, the sounds of the family gathering continuing around us. I want everyone out, I said without preamble. Tonight? Now? Mom's face immediately shifted to wounded surprise. Sarah, honey, you can't be serious. People have traveled from other states for this reunion. Great Uncle Frank drove 16 hours from Toronto. That's a problem you created by planning this without telling me, I replied. This is my home. I live here. I pay for it. And I did not consent to host a family reunion, but we're family, Dad protested, using the same argument he deployed countless times before. We don't need formal arrangements between us. Apparently we do, I said, because you've just demonstrated that without formal arrangements, you'll take whatever you want without asking. Mom's wounded expression deepened. We were trying to do something nice, something that would bring the family together. Your space is perfect for this kind of gathering, and we knew you'd want to contribute to family unity. You knew I'd want to contribute, I repeated, but you didn't think I'd want to be asked. You didn't think I'd want to be involved in planning. You didn't think I'd want advance notice that my home was being used as an event venue. We thought you'd be more comfortable if we handled everything, Dad said. You always seem so busy, so stressed about work. We wanted to remove any burden from you. The paternalistic condescension in his explanation was staggering. They had decided what would make me comfortable without consulting me. They had determined what I could handle without asking me. They had made choices about my life and my space based on their assumptions about my availability and preferences. Where did people sleep last night? I asked suddenly, a new thought occurring to me. The guilty expressions that crossed both their faces answered my question before they spoke. Some of the older relatives needed comfortable accommodations, Mom admitted. We let them use your guest room and your bedroom, since you weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow. The violation was complete. Not only had they used my home for an event I wasn't told about, they had allowed strangers to sleep in my bed. My most private space had been treated as a hotel room for elderly relatives who couldn't afford proper accommodations. You let people sleep in my bed, I said slowly, making sure I understood correctly. They're not people, they're family, Mom protested. And we changed the sheets. Everything is clean. The fact that they had changed the sheets was somehow more insulting than if they had simply left evidence of the intrusion. It suggested premeditation, an awareness that what they were doing was wrong, coupled with a belief that minor remediation would make it acceptable. At that moment, Derek appeared in the kitchen doorway. Sarah, we're ready to start Uncle Frank's presentation. Everyone's gathered in your bedroom waiting for you. I looked at Derek, then at my parents, and felt a strange calm descend over me. The situation was so far beyond reasonable that anger seemed inadequate. This required strategy. Tell Uncle Frank that the presentation is postponed, I said to Derek. There's been a change of plans. Derek looked confused, but before he could ask questions, I continued. Please let everyone know that due to an unexpected scheduling conflict, we'll need to move the gathering to a different venue. What scheduling conflict? Mom asked sharply. My scheduling conflict, I replied. I live here, and I have decided that tonight is not convenient for hosting 85 house guests. Dad's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Sarah, you can't just kick everyone out. Some of these people haven't seen each other in years. Uncle Frank has prepared stories. We've been planning this for months. Then you should have planned it somewhere else, I said simply. Or you should have asked me before planning it here. Mom's wounded act was giving way to irritation. This is incredibly selfish, Sarah. These are elderly relatives who have traveled long distances. Where exactly do you expect them to go on a Saturday night? The same places they would have gone if you had planned this reunion at an appropriate venue from the beginning, I replied. Hotels exist. Community centers can be rented. Church halls are available. You had months to arrange proper accommodations, and chose not to. We chose to use family space for a family gathering, Dad countered. Since when do we need to pay for commercial venues when we have perfectly good space available? Since the space belongs to someone who wasn't consulted about its use, I said. Derek was still hovering in the doorway, clearly uncertain about how to handle the obvious family conflict unfolding in front of him. I turned to him directly. Derek, please let everyone know that due to the unexpected change in circumstances, Tonight's gathering will need to be relocated. I suggest people start making alternative arrangements for accommodations. He looked to my parents for guidance, clearly hoping they would override my instructions. Sarah, Mom said, her voice taking on the manipulative tone I remembered from childhood conflicts. Please don't ruin this for everyone. This reunion is important to the family. People have been looking forward to it for months. Some of these relatives are in their 80s and 90s. This might be the last time we're all together. The emotional manipulation was expertly deployed, designed to make me feel responsible for destroying precious family memories and potentially depriving elderly relatives of final opportunities for connection. It was the same tactic that had worked throughout my childhood and adolescence, making me feel selfish for having needs or boundaries that conflicted with family expectations. But something had changed. Maybe it was the professional confidence I had gained from the San Francisco conference. Maybe it was the exhaustion of years of boundary violations. Maybe it was simply the clear-sightedness that comes from having your most basic assumptions about respect and consent completely shattered. If this reunion was important to the family, I said calmly, then the family should have planned it properly. If people have been looking forward to it for months, then it should have been organized, with proper venues and accommodations months ago. If these are precious final opportunities for connection, then they deserved better planning than secretly commandeering someone's private home. Dad tried a different approach. We can discuss this later, after the weekend, but right now, we have a house full of family members who need somewhere to be. You're right, I agreed. You do have a house full of family members who need somewhere to be. Unfortunately, that somewhere cannot be my apartment because I did not agree to host them. I turned back to Derek. Please make the announcement. People need time to make alternative arrangements, and the longer we delay, the more difficult that becomes. Derek looked helplessly between me and my parents one more time, then reluctantly headed back toward my bedroom to deliver the unwelcome news. The next 30 minutes were chaotic. Derek's announcement was met with confusion, then disbelief, then a growing murmur of discontent as relatives began to understand that they were being asked to leave. I positioned myself in my living room, maintaining a calm but firm presence. While conversations swirled around me, some relatives approached me directly, attempting various forms of persuasion. Great Aunt Martha expressed shock at my inhospitable behavior. Cousin Jennifer tried to mediate, suggesting we could work something out that would allow the reunion to continue. Uncle Frank, the elderly gentleman who had driven from Toronto specifically for this gathering, looked genuinely hurt and confused about why he was suddenly unwelcome. Each conversation was difficult, but I maintained the same basic message. I had not been informed about this event, I had not agreed to host it, and while I regretted any inconvenience, people would need to make alternative arrangements. My parents circulated through the crowd, clearly trying to present damage control while undermining my position. I overheard fragments of their conversations with relatives. She's just tired from traveling. Work stress. She'll feel differently in the morning. We can probably work this out. After about an hour, the apartment began to empty. Some relatives left immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama and eager to distance themselves from the conflict. Others lingered, hoping the situation might resolve itself if they waited long enough. A few elderly relatives looked genuinely distressed about finding alternative accommodations on short notice. It was heartbreaking, but I reminded myself that their distress was the result of poor planning by the event organizers, not cruelty on my part. I had not created this situation. I was simply refusing to be victimized by it. By 11 p.m., only my parents and Derek remained. The three of them sat in my living room, surrounded by the detritus of the abandoned reunion leftover food, folding chairs, scattered family photos, and the blood is thicker than water banner that still hung on my wall like a mocking reminder of the evening's events. I hope you're satisfied, Mom said, her earlier manipulation having evolved into open resentment. You've ruined what could have been a beautiful family memory. I've protected my right to make decisions about my own home, I corrected. If you wanted to create beautiful family memories, you should have planned an event that included me from the beginning. Derek, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the exodus, finally spoke. Sarah, I get that you're upset about not being told, but did you really have to kick everyone out? Some of those people are going to have trouble finding hotels tonight. The fact that Derek, who had already overstayed his welcome in my home for months, was now criticizing my handling of another boundary violation was almost amusing. Derek, I said, you lived in my guest room for 4 months without ever asking if it was still convenient for me. You're probably not the best person to lecture me about household boundaries. He had the decency to look uncomfortable with that reminder. Dad tried one final approach. What if we compromise? The relatives who drove long distances could stay overnight and we'll cancel the rest of the reunion activities just for tonight, and then everyone goes home tomorrow. No, I said simply. This ends tonight. Completely. The finality in my voice seemed to register with all 3 of them simultaneously. After months of incremental boundary violations that I had tolerated or adapted to, they were discovering that there was a line I would not allow them to cross over. The next hour, my parents and Derek gathered their belongings and helped remove the reunion decorations from my walls. The folding chairs were disassembled and returned to wherever they had come from. The leftover food was packed up and distributed among the few relatives who were still accessible by phone. As they prepared to leave, Mom made one final attempt at emotional manipulation. I want you to know that you've broken my heart tonight. I raised you to value family, and this selfishness is not who I thought you were. The accusation stung, but I had developed enough clarity to recognize it for what it was: a desperate attempt to reframe my reasonable boundaries as moral failings. You raised me to value family, I agreed. But you apparently didn't raise me to be family. If you had, you would have included me in planning a family reunion instead of secretly using my home for one. After they left, I walked through my apartment, surveying the damage. Furniture was still displaced. My office was in chaos. My bedroom smelled of unfamiliar perfumes and had clearly been occupied by multiple people. My bathroom showed evidence of extensive use by strangers, but more than the physical disruption, there was an emotional violation that would take much longer to address. The people I had trusted most had demonstrated that they viewed my autonomy as optional and my consent as unnecessary. They had planned for months to use my space without telling me, and their only regret seemed to be that I had discovered their plan and objected to it. I spent the next several hours restoring my apartment to some semblance of order. As I worked, I realized that this incident had clarified something important about my relationship with my family. The pattern of boundary violations, assumptions about my availability, and dismissal of my autonomous decision-making had been building for years. Tonight had simply been the most egregious example. By dawn, I had made several decisions. First, I was changing the locks on my apartment. My parents' emergency key privileges were permanently revoked. Second, I was establishing formal boundaries about visits that would be communicated in writing and enforced consistently. Third, I was going to pursue the Portland opportunity with Dr. Richardson, regardless of how it might further distance me from my family. The next few days brought a barrage of phone calls and messages from relatives who had attended the reunion. Some were angry, feeling that I had overreacted to what they saw as a minor miscommunication. Others were more understanding, particularly after I explained that I had genuinely been excluded from planning the event in my own home. My parents initially tried to maintain that I was being unreasonable, but as I remained calm and consistent in my position, they gradually began to acknowledge that perhaps they should have handled things differently. The acknowledgement was grudging and incomplete, but it was a start. Derek moved out of my building entirely, finding an apartment across town. The change felt liberating, eliminating the daily reminders of how my boundaries had been ignored and my space had been gradually appropriated. 6 weeks after the reunion incident, I received formal confirmation of the Portland position. Dr. Richardson's project was everything I had hoped for: innovative, challenging, and aligned with my vision for sustainable architecture. The position offered professional growth, financial advancement, and most importantly, distance from family dynamics that had become toxic. When I announced my decision to accept the Portland offer, my parents' reaction was predictably mixed. Dad expressed pride in my professional success while lamenting my move further from home. Mom initially tried guilt-based persuasion, suggesting that I was abandoning family when they needed me most. But something had shifted in our dynamic since the reunion incident. My willingness to enforce boundaries had apparently earned a degree of respect that my previous accommodation had not. While they weren't happy about my relocation, they seemed to understand that their approval was no longer a factor in my decision-making process. The move to Portland was remarkably smooth. Dr. Richardson's team welcomed me warmly, and I quickly found my place in a professional environment that valued innovation and collaboration. My new colleagues treated me as a peer and expert, a refreshing change from family dynamics where my expertise had been consistently undervalued. 3 months into my Portland life, I received an unexpected phone call from Mom. The conversation was different from our previous interactions, more respectful, less presumptuous. She asked about my work, listened to my descriptions of current projects, and seemed genuinely interested in my professional achievements. Near the end of the call, she said something that surprised me. "I've been thinking about the reunion, and I realize we handled it badly. We should have included you in the planning from the beginning. Your home wasn't ours to use without asking." It wasn't a complete apology, but it was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that went further than anything I had expected. The admission felt like a small but significant step toward rebuilding our relationship on more equal terms. Over the following months, our communications continued to improve gradually. My parents began treating me more like an independent adult, whose boundaries deserved respect. They asked before visiting, included me in family planning discussions, and seemed to understand that my career was not a hobby that could be set aside for family convenience. The improvement wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was consistent. By establishing and enforcing clear boundaries, I had apparently created space for a healthier relationship to develop. A year after the reunion incident, I returned to visit my parents in their apartment. The conversation was comfortable, focused on current events and mutual interests rather than family obligations and guilt-based manipulation. When they asked about my work, they listened with genuine attention and asked thoughtful questions. As I prepared to leave, Dad said something that crystallized how much had changed. "We're proud of what you've accomplished in Portland. The sustainable housing project you described sounds like it could really make a difference." It was the kind of recognition and validation I had craved throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Ironically, it had only become possible after I stopped seeking it and started prioritizing my own well-being over family approval. The reunion banner had proclaimed, "Blood is thicker than water," suggesting that family bonds should supersede all other considerations. But I had learned that healthy family bonds require the same respect for autonomy and consent that we expect in all meaningful relationships. Family connections can indeed be thicker than water, but only when they're based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. The strongest family ties are those that are freely chosen and continuously renewed, not those that are demanded or taken for granted. My experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth or autonomy. By insisting on respect and boundaries, I had created space for genuine connection, to develop connection based on who we actually are rather than who we felt obligated to pretend to be. Blood may be thicker than water, but respect is thicker than both. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give your family is the example of someone who values themselves enough to demand that gift in return. As I've built my new life in Portland, surrounded by colleagues who appreciate my contributions and friends who respect my boundaries, I've come to understand that family isn't just about shared genetics or childhood history. It's about creating connections with people who see your worth, support your growth, and treat your autonomy as sacred. The banner in my apartment that night was meant to remind everyone that family obligations are permanent and unquestionable. Instead, it taught me that the most important obligation we have to family is to insist that those relationships be worthy of the love we invest in them. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who take your presence for granted, even when those people are family. And sometimes that walking away is exactly what creates space for them to learn how to value what they had been carelessly discarding. Have you ever had to choose between family harmony and personal boundaries? Have you discovered that sometimes the people who should support you most are the ones who understand your worth the least? Remember that you deserve relationships built on respect and recognition, not obligation and assumption. Your worth is not determined by your willingness to accept poor treatment, even from family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in dynamics that diminish anyone involved. True family connections can survive honest boundaries. Those that can't were probably not as strong as they appeared to be. 5 years have passed since that shocking Saturday night when I discovered my apartment transformed into an unauthorized family reunion venue. As I sit in my Portland office, overlooking the completed Riverside Sustainable Housing Complex, the project that grew from my collaboration with Dr. Richardson, I can hardly recognize the woman who once struggled to set basic boundaries with her family. The complex below represents everything I dreamed of achieving in sustainable architecture. 48 units of affordable housing, each equipped with vertical gardens, solar panels, and rainwater collection systems. The waiting list stretches for months, and 3 other cities have commissioned similar projects. More importantly, the residents have formed a genuine community, one built on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation and guilt. My phone buzzes with a text from Mom. Saw the article about your housing project in Architectural Digest. Dad and I are so proud. Can we schedule a call this weekend to hear more about it? The transformation in our communication still amazes me. The woman who once entered my apartment without permission now asks to schedule phone calls. The parents who dismissed my career as an inconvenient obsession now follow my professional achievements with genuine interest and pride. It wasn't an overnight change. The first year after I moved to Portland was difficult. There were heated phone calls, accusations of abandonment, and attempts to manipulate me back into old patterns. Extended family members chose sides, some supporting my parents' narrative that I had overreacted, others quietly admitting they understood my position. The turning point came during Thanksgiving of my second year in Portland. Instead of the usual guilt-laden invitations to return home for family obligations, Mom called with an unusual request. Sarah, your father and I have been talking. We'd like to visit you in Portland for Thanksgiving, if you'd be comfortable with that. We could stay in a hotel and take you out for dinner. We want to see your new life and understand what you've built there. The simple act of asking permission, of offering to stay in a hotel rather than assuming they could occupy my space, of expressing genuine curiosity about my life, it felt revolutionary. After years of presumptuous demands and dismissive comments, their visit was revelatory for all of us. They toured my modest but beautiful apartment, met my colleagues at an office gathering, and saw firsthand the respect and recognition I had found in my professional community. For the first time, they witnessed me in an environment where my contributions were valued and my boundaries were naturally respected. Dad later told me that seeing my confidence and happiness in Portland made him realize how diminished I had seemed during family interactions back home. You light up when you talk about your work here, he said. We never saw that brightness when you were constantly managing our expectations and accommodating our assumptions about your availability. The insight was painful but necessary. My family had never seen me at my best because I had spent most of our interactions managing their emotional needs rather than expressing my authentic self. 3 years ago, they visited again for the groundbreaking ceremony of the Riverside Project. Watching them beam with pride as local officials praised my innovative design work, seeing them introduce themselves to my colleagues as Sarah's parents with unmistakable joy, it fulfilled a deep longing I had carried since childhood. But the real healing came through smaller, consistent changes in our daily interactions. They began asking about my work with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. They stopped making assumptions about my availability during holidays and started coordinating plans in advance. Most importantly, they started treating my decisions about my own life as valid, even when those decisions differed from what they would have chosen. Derek and I have developed an unexpectedly positive relationship. After moving out of my building, he went through his own period of self-reflection. He called me about 6 months after the reunion incident with a genuine apology. I realize now that I treated your home like a boarding house where I didn't need to pay rent or follow rules, he said. I took advantage of your kindness and your parents' boundary issues. I'm sorry for my part in making you feel like a stranger. In your own space, he's since found his footing professionally and personally. We exchange holiday cards and occasional updates, maintaining the kind of comfortable distance that works well for cousins who have different approaches to life but mutual respect for each other's choices. The extended family reaction was more mixed. Some relatives continued to view me as the selfish family member who prioritized career over connection. Others gradually came to understand that my insistence on boundaries had actually created space for more authentic relationships to develop. Great uncle Frank, the elderly gentleman who had driven from Toronto for the reunion, surprised everyone by sending me a letter the following Christmas. In shaky handwriting, he wrote, "I was hurt and confused that night when you asked everyone to leave, but I've had time to think about it, and I realized that no one asked you if you wanted to host us. We assumed your space was available because we're family, but families should ask permission too. I hope you'll forgive an old man for not understanding that sooner." His letter moved me to tears. It represented the possibility that even long-established family dynamics could evolve when people were willing to examine their assumptions and adjust their behavior accordingly. Last month, I received an invitation that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. My cousin Jennifer, who had enthusiastically embraced the unauthorized reunion, was planning her daughter's high school graduation party. The invitation read, "We're hoping to celebrate Emily's graduation with a family gathering. Would you be interested in attending? We're planning to hold it at the community center and would love to include you in the planning if you're available." And interested, the difference was remarkable. Instead of assumptions about my participation, there was a genuine invitation. Instead of commandeering someone's private space, they had arranged an appropriate venue. Instead of excluding me from planning while expecting me to provide resources, they were offering to include me in decisions if I wanted to participate. I called Jennifer to accept the invitation and offer to help with planning. Our conversation was warm and respectful, focused on creating an event that would honor Emily's achievements while being convenient for all the family members who wanted to attend. "I learned something from that reunion disaster at your apartment," Jennifer admitted during our call. "We got so caught up in the excitement of bringing everyone together that we forgot to include the person whose space we were using. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to the relatives who ended up scrambling for hotels that night." The acknowledgement felt like a gift. It confirmed that the difficult confrontation had led to genuine learning and growth, not just temporary compliance. Emily's graduation party was everything a family celebration should be. Held in a rented community center with proper planning and coordination, It brought together relatives from multiple states in an environment where everyone felt welcome and included. I contributed by creating a photo display showcasing Emily's academic and artistic achievements, using my design skills to help honor her accomplishments. During the party, I found myself genuinely enjoying conversations with relatives I had previously found exhausting. Without the underlying tension of boundary violations and unspoken resentments, we could connect over shared interests and genuine affection. Mom and Dad attended the party as well, and I watched them interact with extended family with new eyes. They spoke about my Portland projects with evident pride, sharing articles they had saved and updates they had gathered from our regular phone calls. They had become my champions within the family rather than my managers or translators. At one point during the evening, Great Aunt Martha, who had been particularly critical during the reunion incident, approached me with a surprising comment. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I was angry that night when you asked everyone to leave, but I've had time to think about it. We invaded your home without asking, and that wasn't right. I wouldn't want people doing that to me." Family or not, her apology was unexpected and deeply meaningful. It represented the possibility that even the most entrenched family dynamics could shift when people were willing to examine their behavior honestly. As I drove home to Portland after Emily's party, I reflected on how much had changed in 5 years. The family connections I had always craved were finally developing, but only after I had insisted on the respect and boundaries that made genuine connection possible. The professional recognition I had sought was abundant, but it had come through focusing on my work rather than trying to make my family understand its value. The personal autonomy I had fought for was secure, but it had created space for voluntary family involvement rather than obligatory accommodation. Most importantly, I had learned that love and respect are not opposing forces. The people who truly care about your well-being will adjust their behavior when you communicate your boundaries clearly and consistently. Those who continue to violate your autonomy after you've explained its importance are demonstrating that their comfort matters more to them than your dignity. Today, as I prepare to break ground on my third major sustainable housing project, I carry with me the confidence that comes from knowing my worth is not negotiable. My family relationships are stronger because they're based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided accommodation. My professional achievements are more meaningful because they reflect my authentic priorities rather than attempts to prove my value to people who were unwilling to see it. The banner from that long-ago reunion night proclaimed, "Blood is thicker than water." I've learned that while family bonds can indeed be powerful and enduring, they reach their full strength only when they're built on the foundation of mutual respect and voluntary connection. Blood may be thicker than water, but respect is the vessel that holds them both. Without it, even the deepest family connections can become toxic and destructive. With it, even distant relationships can become sources of genuine support and joy. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is the example of someone who knows their worth and insists others recognize it too. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes anyone involved in the relationship. As I look toward the future, I see continued professional growth, deeper friendships, and family relationships that enhance rather than drain my energy. I see a life built on authentic choices rather than obligatory accommodations, surrounded by people who celebrate my successes rather than minimize them. The journey from that shocking Saturday night to this moment of peace and professional fulfillment has taught me that boundaries are not walls that separate us from love, they're the foundation that makes genuine love possible. When we insist on respect, we create space for the kind of connections that actually nourish our souls rather than deplete our energy. To anyone reading this who recognizes elements of their own family dynamics in my story, you deserve relationships that celebrate your autonomy rather than diminish it. You deserve family connections that are freely chosen rather than guilt-imposed. You deserve love that enhances your sense of self-worth rather than requiring you to sacrifice it. The path to those relationships might require difficult conversations and uncomfortable boundaries. It might involve disappointing people who have become accustomed to your unlimited accommodation. But on the other side of that discomfort lies the possibility of family connections that truly honor the best in everyone involved. Your worth is not determined by your willingness to accept poor treatment, even from people who share your DNA. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to show them what healthy relationships actually look like. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to insist on nothing less than the respect you deserve. True family connections can survive honest boundaries. Those that can't were never as strong as they appear to be. The relationships worth keeping are those that become deeper and more meaningful when built on a foundation of mutual respect and authentic choice. 5 years later, I can say with certainty that the most important reunion I ever attended was the one where I finally reunited with my own sense of worth and dignity. Everything else, the professional success, the improved family relationships, the personal peace flowed naturally from that fundamental reconnection with my own value. Blood is thicker than water, but self-respect is thicker than both. And when you honor that truth consistently, you create space for the kind of family connections that actually deserve the love you have to offer.